The chamber smelled like ozone and old power. That was the first thing Ambassador Sira Voss always noticed when she entered the grand deliberation hall of the Verath station. That sharp, electric scent that clung to the recycled air like the memory of 1,000 arguments. The station itself was ancient by human standards, older than the Roman Empire, older than the pyramids, constructed by the Dravasi when humanity was still learning to plant wheat. It orbited a pale dwarf star in the neutral zone between four empires, and its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that humanity didn't even have names for yet. Sira had been coming here for 4 years. She still hadn't gotten used to the smell. She walked to her delegation's table, the small one, tucked near the eastern observation port, positioned so the light from the dwarf star fell directly into the eyes of whoever sat there during morning sessions. No one had told her the table placement was intentional. No one had needed to. She had figured it out on her third visit, when she noticed that the Keth High delegation sat directly beneath the chamber's primary atmospheric processor, which kept their methane-rich breathing pocket cooler and more comfortable. Every detail in this room was a message. Her table said, "You are guests here, and temporary ones at that." She sat down, arranged her notes, and prepared to be ignored. The session opened with the usual procession of announcements read by Secretary General Vurath of the Orin Collective, a tall, pale being with 4 eyes, and the measured cadence of someone who had been speaking in this hall for longer than most human nations had existed. The agenda was routine. Border arbitration between the Keth Dominion and the Palian Free Systems over a disputed mining corridor. Trade tariff renegotiation between the Dravasi hegemony and the Vorthian conquered. A motion to reclassify 3 uninhabited star systems in the Outer Rim. Humanity was not on the agenda. Humanity was never on the agenda. Sira listened as the Vorthian senior delegate, a broad creature named Oxavar IV, launched into a prepared statement about species maturity that was, quite transparently, directed at the human delegation without ever naming them. The language was smooth, diplomatic, almost elegant, but the meaning underneath it was blunt as a boot heel. Civilizations that have not earned their standing should observe rather than participate. Several delegates nodded. A few exchanged the alien equivalent of knowing smiles. Sira kept her expression neutral and wrote the word patience on her paper notepad in English, a language none of the room's translation systems were calibrated to read. She had written that word in this room 47 times. She had counted. 3 hours into the session, as Oxavar IV was outlining humanity's failure to meet Galactic standard infrastructure benchmarks. A metric humanity had been given no input in designing. Sira's personal communicator vibrated once against her wrist. A secured channel. Level obsidian clearance. There were exactly 11 people in human space authorized to send her a level obsidian transmission, and every single one of them knew never to do it unless the moment had arrived. She glanced at the message beneath the table. 4 words. Goliath is ready, confirm. Sira looked up at the chamber, at the 17 delegations arranged in their careful hierarchy of importance, at the ancient walls that had watched humanity sit at its small table and smile politely for 4 years, at the light from the dwarf star still falling directly into her eyes. She typed her confirmation with her thumb, slid the communicator back to her wrist, and folded her hands on the table. And for the first time in 4 years at this table, she smiled. Not the careful, diplomatic smile she had practiced in front of mirrors, not the patient, deferential smile she wore when species 3 times humanity's age spoke over her mid-sentence. This was something else. Something that made the junior Keth attaché sitting 2 tables over Paw's mid-note and experience an instinct his species called Velthrak, a word with no direct translation, but which roughly meant the unsettling feeling that the creature you've been dismissing has been waiting for something, and it just arrived. Oxavar IV finished his statement. The chamber applauded in its various cultural ways. Secretary General Vurath turned to the human delegation, as courtesy technically required, and asked if Earth's representatives wished to respond to the infrastructure assessment. Sierra stood. "Thank you, Secretary General," she said, her voice calm and carrying easily through the translator implants every delegate wore. "We don't wish to respond to the assessment." She paused just long enough. "We would, however, like to formally request an emergency full-session meeting of the Galactic Council to convene immediately at coordinates I'm transmitting to all delegations now." The room shifted. Not dramatically, these were ancient and dignified species, most of them, but it shifted. Vurath's 4 eyes blinked in a sequence that translated to mild surprise. The coordinates appeared on every delegate's display simultaneously. Dead space. Beyond the Keth frontier, nothing there, nothing charted there, nothing logged there. Oxivar 4 let out a low sound that translated, somewhat loosely, to what could humans possibly have in empty space. Vurath called the motion. It passed with 14 votes. Most delegates agreed out of little more than mild curiosity, the way one agrees to watch a child attempt a magic trick. Humanity had never called an emergency session before. It would probably be nothing. Perhaps a misidentified comet they wanted to name after themselves. As Sierra gathered her notes and walked toward the door, the Keth High Admiral Drevas stopped her with a hand on her arm. He was massive, nearly 3 meters tall, wearing a ceremonial uniform decorated with the kills of 40 campaigns. "Ambassador Voss," he said, translator rendering his voice into something smooth and slightly amused. "What exactly do you think you're going to show us out there?" Sierra looked up at him. The smile hadn't left her face. 90 years of patience," she said. And she walked out. 22 years before Sierra Voss smiled in the Grand Deliberation Hall. A junior intelligence analyst named Thesvar of the Keth Dominion filed a report that nobody read. The report was 63 pages long. It was thorough, methodical, and, in hindsight, the most important document produced in the Keth intelligence apparatus in the past century. Thesvar had been assigned to monitor human space, a posting considered so dull it was functionally a punishment. Humans were manageable. They had only cracked faster-than-light travel 90 years prior. Their military consisted of a few hundred patrol frigates, 24 diplomatic escort cruisers, and a handful of aging destroyers that Keth tactical assessors had classified as non-threatening with high confidence. Monitoring human space was the kind of assignment given to analysts who had made a mistake somewhere, or who had no powerful allies in the bureaucracy. Thesvar had neither allies nor had she made a mistake. She had simply, at a department mixer, told her division chief that his threat model for the Outer Rim was incomplete. She was assigned to human space the following morning. She didn't complain. She read everything. Every public human transmission, every shipping manifest, every infrastructure report filed with the Galactic Trade Authority. And after 8 months, she began finding things that didn't fit. Gravitational readings near 3 human outer colony systems that suggested mass far in excess of anything on record. Energy signatures near the human industrial moon of Callum 9 that spiked briefly and then vanished. Not the signature of a malfunction or a test, but the deliberate, controlled spike of something powering up and then being deliberately suppressed. Human shipyards on 4 separate outer worlds that publicly filed civilian reconstruction and upgrade notices, and then went completely dark. No visitor logs, no shipping traffic, no labor contracts filed with the Galactic Commerce Registry. She built her report over 18 months. She cross-referenced the gravitational anomalies with known hull mass ratios of every vessel class in the galaxy. She mapped the energy signatures against known propulsion technologies. She ran the numbers 4 times, then had a computer run them 6 more times because she didn't trust herself, because the answer that kept appearing made no tactical sense given everything the intelligence community believed about humanity's capabilities. The report's conclusion, rendered in precise Keth technical language, stated, recommendation, immediate reclassification of Terran military capability assessment from low interest to critical monitor. Evidence suggests construction of vessel-class objects with mass profiles consistent with hegemony grade or above capital ship design. Source of construction technology unknown. Timeline of capability unknown. Confidence in anomaly data, 94.7%. Her division chief read the executive summary. He called her into his office. "Thesvar," he said, leaning back in his chair with the easy comfort of a being who had held power for a long time. "Humans have been in space for 2 centuries and in FTL-capable space for 90 years. The Dravasi were building carrier groups before humans had electricity. Do you understand the gap we're discussing?" "Yes, sir. That's why the anomalies are significant. The gap makes them." "The gap makes your conclusion impossible." He slid the report back across the desk. "Energy spikes near industrial moons are equipment malfunctions. Gravitational readings in poorly charted outer space are instrument error. Dark shipyards are budget freezes." He folded his hands. "File it in the archive. Focus your monitoring on Pallian smuggling routes. That's a real problem." Thesvar filed the report. It was archived under classification level, routine subcategory, human space sub-subcategory, infrastructure noise. She was not the only one. In the Orin Collective's External Watch Division, an analyst named Perev-1 had flagged a pattern of human vessels taking unusual routes through the outer rim. Not smuggling routes, not trade routes, but wide, looping paths that happened to pass near 17 different uninhabited star systems that the Galactic Cartography Authority had charted as geologically unremarkable. Perev-1 had requested spectral analysis of those systems. The analysis came back noting trace heavy element depletion in 4 of the 17 systems, consistent with large-scale extraction of the specific materials used in military-grade hull plating. Perev-1's supervisor told her the depletion was a naturally occurring geological variation. Perev-1 pointed out that the probability of 17 separate geologically unremarkable systems, all showing the same specific depletion pattern from natural causes, was approximately 1 in 900 million. Her supervisor told her that statistics could be misleading when applied to astronomical scales. She was reassigned to monitoring Vorthian agricultural export licenses. In the Dravasi hegemony, the ancient masters of galactic military power, 3 separate analysts had flagged human anomalies over a 12-year period. The most senior of them, an elder-rank intelligence officer named Vraxa, had compiled all 3 reports into a single consolidated document and sent it directly to the hegemony's military intelligence directorate with a personal note that read, "I am aware that this conclusion will be dismissed. I am filing it anyway so that, when it becomes relevant, the record shows we were told." The Military Intelligence Directorate filed Vraxa's document under "Speculative," authored by analyst approaching retirement. Vraxa retired 2 years later. She spent her remaining years tending a garden on a quiet Dravasi colony world, watching the stars, and occasionally, on clear nights, looking in the direction of human space with an expression her family could not quite interpret. Meanwhile, in the dark between the stars, in hollowed moons and lightless construction bays, and sealed facilities that didn't exist on any public registry, humanity built. No one was watching. Or rather, people were watching. They were just being told not to trust what they saw. It began with a funeral. Not a famous funeral, not a state ceremony. The funeral of a man named Hiroshi Tamura, an engineer from Osaka who died at 61 from a cardiac event inside a sealed facility on the human colony of New Carthage, a facility that officially was a water reclamation plant. Hiroshi left behind a wife, 2 daughters, and a personnel file that would remain classified for decades. He also left behind a set of technical blueprints for a modular hull assembly framework that his team had spent 11 years perfecting, and which would eventually form the structural skeleton of the largest warship ever constructed by any species in the history of the known galaxy. His daughters were told he died doing important work. They were not told how important. The decision that created Project Goliath was not made in a single dramatic meeting. It didn't emerge from a war council or a presidential decree delivered in a grand hall with flags behind it. It emerged slowly, the way most profound human decisions do, out of accumulated humiliation, quiet fury, and a collective understanding that reached critical mass across a dozen governments and 100 private conversations in the years following what historians would later call the Vethara incidents. The Vethara incidents were not dramatic either, which was part of what made them so corrosive. In the 53rd year of humanity's membership in the Galactic community, a human diplomatic vessel named the Endurance was seized by Keth border authorities while passing through the Vethara corridor, a route the Keth had unilaterally reclassified as sovereign space without notifying the Galactic Trade Authority or informing the human government. The crew of 41 was held for 9 months. Their personal communications were read and archived. Their vessel's navigational database was copied. When the Endurance was finally released, the Keth filed a complaint against humanity with the Galactic Council for unauthorized navigation of contested sovereign space. And the Council, in a session that Sira Voss's predecessor, Ambassador de Chiren, sat through with shaking hands, accepted the complaint as valid. The human government filed a counter-complaint. It was archived. 3 years later, Keth border expansion quietly incorporated 4 human-settled asteroid settlements. The 6,000 people living in those settlements were given 60 days to relocate. They did. No one at the Galactic Council called it what it was. It was the copying of the Endurance's navigational database that broke something in the people who would eventually create Goliath. Not the seizure, not the humiliation of the false complaint. The copying of the database, the casual, arrogant assumption that humanity's technology was there to be taken, that their systems could be opened and read like a book, that no consequence was coming. That was the thing that turned quiet anger into cold, generational purpose. The first Goliath planning session was held in a basement room in Auckland, New Zealand, attended by 7 people representing 3 governments and 2 private aerospace firms. No recording was made. No minutes were kept. The agreement they reached was entirely verbal and was never written down in any form that anyone later found. The agreement was simple. They would build something so large, so absolute, so irrefutably real that no species in the galaxy would ever again calculate that humanity was safe to dismiss. They would not announce it. They would not threaten with it. They would simply build it and wait for the right moment and let the math speak. They called it Goliath, and then they got to work. The construction was broken into 17 phases across 11 different facilities, distributed across 6 star systems, so that no single piece of intelligence would ever reveal the whole picture. Hiroshi Tamura's hull framework was Phase 3. A woman named Dr. Amara Osai spent 30 years perfecting the vessel's propulsion array from a classified station, orbiting a brown dwarf that didn't appear on any public star chart. She never met most of the people she was building with. She communicated through encrypted channels with code names. She named her cat Goliath. Nobody outside the facility knew why she found this funny. Children grew up inside these programs, not metaphorically, literally. Families lived in the sealed facilities. Children were born there, educated there, brought into the work as they came of age, and given security clearances before they were given driver's licenses. They understood, in the way that children of any long purpose understand, that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were not raised to be angry. They were raised to be meticulous. The secrecy required wasn't just operational, it was societal. A species that had struggled for centuries with internal conflict, with the fractures of nations and ideologies, had quietly decided that this one thing would hold. Governments changed. Economies fluctuated. Leaders came and went. Goliath continued. It was the single most sustained act of unified human will in recorded history, and no one outside a very specific clearance level knew it existed. The Unbroken Horizon, the name chosen in the program's 63rd year, by a committee of engineers who had never seen a horizon, having spent their entire lives on sealed stations, took its first power-on test 17 months before Sira Voss smiled in the Grand Deliberation Hall. The test lasted 4 seconds. It powered every sensor in 3 star systems simultaneously. All those readings were classified as equipment malfunctions by agencies that were not told to look deeper. Hiroshi Tamura's eldest daughter, now 53, was present at the power-on test. She stood in the observation bay and watched the lights come on across a hull that stretched further than she could see, and she thought about her father, who died before he could see this, and she cried without making a sound, because she had been trained since childhood to operate in silence. He died doing important work. He had. The fleet of Galactic Council vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel within 2 minutes of each other, spread across a rough formation that covered roughly 300,000 kilometers of open space. 17 delegations in 17 vessels, ranging from the Oran diplomatic cruiser, sleek, silver, elegant, to the Keth military observer ship, which bristled with weapon arrays even on a diplomatic mission, because the Keth considered bristling with weapons the same way humans considered wearing shoes, simply what you did before going outside. Dead space greeted them. That was the only accurate description. The region was catalogued, charted, and confirmed empty. No debris fields, no asteroid belts, no rogue planets, just the faint background radiation of the universe doing its slow, ancient business and the distant light of stars too far away to warm anything. Admiral Drevos stood on the bridge of the Keth observer ship, Dominion's Edge, and stared at his sensor display with an expression that his crew could not comfortably read. He had led 40 campaigns. He had stood in the wreckage of enemy command ships and felt nothing but the clean satisfaction of a complete tactical picture. He did not feel that now. He felt, in a language his species struggled to articulate, something between amusement and the first faint edge of a much less comfortable emotion. "Confirm the coordinates," he said. "Confirmed, Admiral. We are exactly where the human ambassador directed us. And there is nothing here." "Correct, Admiral. Nothing detectable within our sensor range." Drevos almost smiled. Humans. Even their dramatic gestures were slightly incompetent. He opened a channel to Ambassador Voss's diplomatic shuttle, which had arrived a minute before the Council fleet and now sat quietly off the formation's starboard side, running lights blinking with patient regularity. "Ambassador," he said, the translator smoothing his voice into something almost cordial. "I appreciate the invitation, but I confess the venue is somewhat underwhelming. Is there something specific you wished us to see, or have we traveled several light years to observe an exceptionally empty sector of space?" Voss's voice came back immediately, calm, almost gentle. "Give it 11 seconds, Admiral." He opened his mouth to respond. His sensor officer spoke first, voice changing register in a way that made every head on the bridge turn. "Admiral, I'm reading. I don't know what I'm reading. The mass sensor is." 11 seconds, Voss said again. The first thing they heard was the sound through the hull, not exactly sound, because space carries no sound, but the pressure wave of something massive displacing it nearby, translated into a low, resonant vibration that moved through every ship in the formation. Every species and every vessel felt it differently. Keth crew members felt it in their secondary chest cavity. Oran delegates felt it as a harmonic in their auditory membranes. Humans in Voss's shuttle felt it in their back teeth. Then the unbroken horizon began to appear. It didn't decloak the way any ship in the galaxy decloaked, all at once, a shape materializing from interference. It revealed itself in sections. The bow first, an armored prow that could have used the Keth observer ship as a decorative ornament on its forward array. Then the primary hull, rolling out of stealth along its length like a continent rising from the ocean. Then the secondary hull beneath it, and the weapons platforms along its flanks, each one larger than most Corvette-class vessels in the Keth Dominion fleet. Then the engine assembly at the rear, 4 primary drive cores, each one a sphere of contained gravitational force that distorted the sensor readings of every ship in formation just by existing. 43 kilometers from bow to stern. It took 62 seconds to fully decloak. The Galactic Council fleet was completely silent for the entire duration. Drevos had not moved. He stood perfectly still, with his four hands clasped behind his back, and watched the unbroken horizon finish materializing in the space ahead of him, and something happened to his tactical mind that had never happened to it before. It tried to assess the threat. It ran through engagement protocols. It calculated angles, weapon ranges, response times. It did everything it was trained to do. And then it stopped, because there was nothing to calculate. There was no scenario in his training, no battle doctrine in 4 decades of warfare, no strategic framework in the entire Keth military tradition that covered this. The ship ahead of him was not a tactical problem. It was a geological event. On the Oran diplomatic cruiser, Secretary General Vurath attempted to access the threat assessment system and got back a result he had never seen in 40 years of service. The screen simply showed a blinking cursor. The AI was still processing. It had been processing since the ship began decloaking. It was still processing now. Vurath stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment and then, with great dignity, turned it off. On the Dravasi Hegemony's observation vessel, Elder Delegate Vren, the oldest being in the Council fleet who had served in this capacity for over 2 centuries, sat very still in her command chair. Her aides watched her. She watched the unbroken horizon. After nearly a full minute, she said one word in her native tongue. Her aides had heard her speak in every political context imaginable, in crisis and triumph and tedium. They had never heard her use this word before. It translated approximately as, "Oh." In the silence, Voss's voice came across the open channel again. "This is the TRS Unbroken Horizon," she said. "Titan class. She's been in construction for 61 years. She is crewed by 12,000 personnel and currently operating at minimum power." A pause. "We have 6 more." Another pause. Then, Secretary General Vurath, "We'd like to formally call the emergency session to order." Emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the most unusual location in the body's long history. A holographic relay established between 17 vessels floating in the shadow of the unbroken horizon, because no one had suggested moving to a different location, and no one seemed capable of making that suggestion, because to suggest moving away from the unbroken horizon would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it required finishing the thought that acknowledging it had started. And most of the delegates were not quite ready to finish that thought. Vurath called the session to order with less ceremony than usual. Sira Voss appeared in the holographic relay from the unbroken horizon's bridge, standing, not seated, in a room that the relay's cameras captured in wide enough angle to show the scale of the command infrastructure behind her. The bridge alone was larger than the entire Oran diplomatic cruiser. "I'd like to begin," she said, "with a brief technical overview." The Unbroken Horizon Systems officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, who had grown up on one of the sealed construction stations and had never in her 28 years seen a sunrise, began transmitting data to every delegate's display. Not weapon specifications, not threat assessments, engineering data, construction timelines, material sourcing records, hull composition analysis. The kind of transparent, careful documentation that said, "We are not hiding what this is. We want you to understand exactly what this is." What this was, the data made clear, was a masterpiece of engineering that should have been impossible for a species 90 years out of FTL travel. The delegates who had technical advisors immediately consulted them. The advisors consulted the data. Then they consulted each other. The conversations that followed had a similar shape in every delegation: initial skepticism, then careful rereading, then the slow arrival of an expression that mixed professional admiration with personal alarm. The Keth technical advisor was a veteran naval engineer named Brex 9, who had designed several of the Dominion's most advanced cruiser classes. He looked at the hull composition data for approximately 4 minutes, and then told Admiral Drevas, in a voice stripped of every pretension of calm, that the material configuration used in the Unbroken Horizon's primary armor plating was something Keth Naval Research had theorized as possible, but had not yet achieved in practice. Drevas asked what the implications were. Brex 9 said, "It means our standard anti-capital ship munitions would not penetrate the outer hull, Drevos asked what he meant by standard. Brex 9 said, I mean all of them. In the Dravasi contingent, the conversation was quieter and in some ways more devastating. The Dravasi hegemony was the galaxy's oldest military power. They had been building warships before most species had agriculture. Their capital ships were the benchmark against which everyone else's were measured. Elder Delegate Vren's technical consul, a being who had spent a century studying every warship design in the known galaxy, spent 7 minutes with the data before he said, the drive system alone reclassifies human capability by at least 3 categories. They are not a developing military power. They are, by these specifications, a Tier 1 military civilization. He paused. They went from Tier 4 to Tier 1 without anyone noticing. Vren didn't respond for a long moment. They noticed, she said finally, quietly. We just weren't listening. On the Unbroken Horizons bridge, Sira Voss watched the data land in real time through the relay feeds. She had been doing this long enough to read alien body language. The specific stillness that descended on the Keth delegation, the rapid quiet conferring in the Orin contingent, the Vorthian senior delegate Oxivar gripping the edge of his display console in a way that suggested he was either very cold or very frightened. She felt no pleasure in it. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had prepared for this moment for 4 years, had rehearsed it, had dreamed about it, had woken at 3 in the morning thinking through every variable, and now that it was here, what she felt was not triumph. What she felt was the specific exhaustion of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Behind her, the Unbroken Horizon continued its slow existence. At minimum power, it was still the most energetically active object within 12 light minutes. Its gravity field had already measurably affected the orbital paths of a small dwarf planet 400,000 kilometers distant. Its passive sensor array, not weapons, not active scanning, just listening, could track every ship in the Council fleet at the molecular level. Lieutenant Commander Anand leaned close to Voss and said, very quietly, Ma'am, the Keth observer ship has been running firing solution calculations for the past 6 minutes. Voss didn't look around. I know. Their best solution requires. I know, Priya. Anand straightened. Should I flag it? Voss considered for 2 seconds. Bring drive core 2 to 15% power. Just 2. Don't say anything about it on the channel. Anand relayed the order. On every sensor array in the Council fleet, the Unbroken Horizon's energy signature, already enormous, climbed measurably. The Keth observer ship's firing solution calculations stopped. In the silence that followed, Drevos stood very still on his bridge and understood several things simultaneously, the most important of which was that the Unbroken Horizon had known they were running calculations, had responded without verbal acknowledgement, and had done so with a precision and restraint that was somehow more alarming than any threat could have been. The vessel wasn't angry, it was patient. That was the most terrifying thing about it. Sira Voss let the technical review run for 40 minutes. She answered questions, technical questions, logistical questions, one surprisingly earnest question from a junior Palian delegate about the metallurgical process used in the primary hull plating. She answered that one in some detail because she appreciated that someone had asked it in good faith. She was a diplomat. She understood the value of good faith, even now. Then she said, I'd like to read something into the official record of this session. She had a physical document in her hands, paper, printed. The delegates could see it on the relay, old-fashioned, deliberate, chosen specifically because paper couldn't be digitally manipulated or disputed after the fact. This is a compiled record, she said, of interactions between the Terran Republic and the Galactic community over the past 90 years. I'm going to read selected entries. This will take some time. I'd ask everyone to remain on the channel. She began. Her voice didn't change register. It didn't rise. It didn't carry the weight of accusation, not overtly. She read each entry the way a physician reads a chart, precisely, factually, without editorializing, which was somehow worse than editorializing would have been, because editorializing would have given the other side something to argue against. Year 4 of Terran Galactic membership. The diplomatic vessel TRS Endurance, carrying 41 crew members on a registered trade route, is seized by Keth border forces in the Vethara corridor. Crew detained 9 months. Vessel's navigational database copied without authorization or compensation. Galactic Council accepts Keth complaint against Terran navigation practices as valid. Human countercomplaint archived, unresolved. Admiral Drevas said nothing. His jaw was very still. Year 11. Keth border expansion incorporates asteroid settlements Vethara 7 through Vethara 10, housing 6,200 human civilians. 60-day relocation notice issued. Galactic Council classification. Internal Keth administrative matter. Year 14. Terran Republic requests equal representation on the Galactic Trade Arbitration Board. Request tabled for further review. As of this session, review has not occurred. Year 19. Human Deep Space Research Vessel TRS Kepler's Promise approached and boarded by Oran patrol craft in unclaimed Outer Rim space. Crew questioned for 7 hours. Research data confiscated under Oran's scientific appropriation protocols, which Terran Republic was not informed existed and had never agreed to. Vurath's 4 eyes shifted. He said nothing. Year 23. At the 47th session of the Galactic Council, Senior Delegate Oxavar 4 of the Vorthian Conquered States, in open session, that the Terran Republic's inclusion in the galactic community may have been, quote, premature given species developmental benchmarks. The statement is not challenged by any delegate. It is not struck from the record. Oxavar 4 had gone very still. His grip on the console had loosened, because his hands were no longer responding to voluntary command in quite the way they usually did. Voss continued. She read for 22 minutes. Trade agreements violated within months of signing. Human scientific discoveries reattributed in galactic databases without human consent. A human colony's emergency distress signal. A genuine emergency. A reactor cascade failure that killed 40 people. That sat unacknowledged in the Galactic Emergency Network queue for 11 days because the Oran operator on duty had deprioritized it as a developing species internal incident. She read each one the same way, flat, documented, inarguable. On the third entry, Drevas attempted to interrupt. Ambassador, I must object to the characterization of. The Unbroken Horizon activated its secondary weapons array. Not aimed, not targeted, simply powered on a row of platforms along its port flank, each one cycling through activation sequence with a soft, deep sound that transmitted through the vibration in every nearby hull. Voss kept reading, didn't acknowledge the interruption, didn't acknowledge the weapon activation either. The two things simply happened simultaneously, and the Council fleet understood their relationship without being told. Drevas did not attempt to interrupt again. On the 8th entry, Oxavar 4 did try to speak, to contextualize, to explain, to deploy the particular diplomatic skill of making a factual event sound like a misunderstanding. Voss stopped, looked directly at his relay image and said, with respect, Senior Delegate, I'm reading the record. The record does not require context. It simply happened. Then she continued. By the 15th entry, the chamber, or rather, the 17 ships floating in formation around the Unbroken Horizon, was completely quiet. Not the polite quiet of a formal session. The specific quiet of beings doing something rare and genuinely uncomfortable. Reckoning. Elder Vren, on the Dravasi vessel, had her eyes closed. Not in sleep. In the Dravasi tradition, closing one's eyes was a gesture of internal accounting, of standing before a ledger and reading it without defense. Her aides had never seen her do it in a public session. When Voss finished, she set the paper document down with a small, precise sound. I want to be clear about what that list is, she said. It is not a list of monsters or villains. It is a list of what happens when a community decides collectively and without explicit discussion that one of its members doesn't quite count. When you decide someone doesn't quite count, you don't need to be cruel. You just need to be consistently comfortable. And comfort is much harder to argue against than cruelty. She paused. But we've been counting, the whole time, every single entry. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own statement. Then Sierra Voss picked up a different sheet of paper. Now, she said, let me tell you what we want. The delegates had prepared themselves, in the 40 seconds between Voss setting down the first document and picking up the second, for demands. The word demands was doing significant structural work in the minds of every being in the formation. They braced for it in their various cultural ways. The Keth straightened their spines. The Oran's multiple hands folded precisely. The Dravasi elder opened her eyes and arranged her expression into the specific neutrality of someone ready to negotiate from a position of severe disadvantage. They were ready for reparations. They were ready for territory. They were ready for formal apologies broadcast on every galactic channel, for symbolic gestures of submission, for a restructuring of the entire galactic order with humanity placed at its apex. They were ready, in their darkest calculations, for something far worse. Sierra Voss read from the second document. The Terran Republic makes 3 requests of the Galactic Council. 3. The word moved through the channel with an almost physical weight. Several delegates exchanged glances. First, Voss said, the return of the asteroid settlements Vethara 7 through Vethara 10 to Terran jurisdiction, with full administrative rights restored and compensation at standard galactic rates for the economic losses incurred by the 6,200 civilians displaced during the original annexation. We have prepared a figure. We believe it's fair. It is not punitive. She paused. In the unbroken horizon's bridge behind her, Lieutenant Commander Annan was watching the sensor feeds, and what she was watching was that the Keth observer ship had, very quietly, powered down its last active firing solution subroutine. Something in the specificity and restraint of 3 requests, she thought, had shifted something in Admiral Drevos's mind. She filed that observation away. Second, Voss continued, an enforceable equal trade and scientific exchange protocol between the Terran Republic and all Council member states, with binding arbitration mechanisms and real consequences for violation. We have a draft treaty. It is 17 pages. It is, I think you'll find, extremely reasonable. We wrote it to be reasonable. Vurath, who had spent 40 years navigating trade disputes, had the instinct of an experienced diplomat. He knew what a reasonable treaty looked like, and he knew it was almost always more effective than a punitive one, because a punitive treaty created enemies who looked for exits, and a reasonable one created parties who had no excuse to leave. He found, to his own surprise, that he respected this. He filed that away as well. Third, Voss said, and here her voice carried something different for the first time, not louder, not harder, but deeper, as though the words were coming from somewhere that had been waiting a very long time. A permanent seat at the primary table of the Galactic Council, with full voting rights, equal procedural standing, and no secondary classifications, no developmental tier designations, and no sunset clauses requiring humanity to prove continued eligibility. She looked up from the document. We are members of this community. We have been members for 90 years. We would like to be treated as such. She set the second document down on top of the first. We are giving the Council 48 hours to ratify all 3 items, in full, witnessed under every signatory's binding law. She looked across the relay at each delegation in turn, a slow, deliberate survey that was not aggressive but was absolutely unflinching. We will be here. She didn't gesture at the unbroken horizon as she said it. She didn't need to. There was a long silence. Then Oxavar 4, who had been reading humanity's developmental shortcomings into the official record at nearly every session for the past decade, spoke. His voice, translated, carried something that was difficult to identify because it was not a thing he had ever expressed in a Galactic Council session before. It was not quite shame. It was the precursor to shame, the moment just before a being decides that an accounting is accurate. Ambassador Voss, he said, The second demand the treaty. You said you wrote it to be reasonable. I did. Would you transmit it now? I would like to read it. Voss looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once to Anand, who transmitted the treaty document to all 17 vessels. Drevas on the Keth ship read through the first 3 pages of the trade protocol in silence. Then he called his political officer to the bridge and said quietly so the channel wouldn't pick it up, "Tell me honestly, if we had been offered these terms in year 1 of their membership, these exact terms with no ship, no demonstration, nothing else, would we have signed them?" His political officer thought about it for an honest moment and said, "Yes, Admiral, we would have called them favorable." Drevas read the next 3 pages. Then why didn't they ask us earlier? The political officer said nothing. Drevas already knew the answer. They didn't ask earlier because they knew they'd be told no, not because the terms were unreasonable, but because the asker was considered small enough that no was an easy answer. That specific realization moved through the fleet, person by person, in different forms and at different speeds, over the next several hours. Vurath formally requested a 1-hour recess to allow delegations to consult internally. Voss agreed immediately. The unbroken horizon did not power down anything during the recess, but it also did not escalate. It simply continued its patient, enormous existence, maintaining a consistent drive output, running regular system checks, going about the routine business of being the most powerful military vessel in the known galaxy as though it were a perfectly ordinary afternoon. 12,000 crew members ate lunch. Someone in engineering started a card game. A duty officer in the third-deck barracks fell asleep on his console and was gently woken by his bunkmate, who told him they were parked next to the entire Galactic Council fleet and he probably shouldn't be seen napping. He said he'd been awake for 31 hours. She said that was fair and covered him with a jacket. With 14 minutes left in the recess, Elder Vren of the Dravasi hegemony opened a private channel to Ambassador Voss. The channel was between the two of them only, no aids, no relay, no record. "Ambassador," Vren said. Her voice was older up close without the formal modulation of a council session. "My analyst, the one who filed the report about your gravitational anomalies 20 years ago, Vraxa. She retired to a garden colony. I don't know if she's still alive." Voss said nothing, waiting. "She was right," Vren said, "and she was punished for being right. That is on us, on me specifically as it happens. I was on the committee that reviewed her work." A pause. "I don't say this expecting absolution. I say it because the record should somewhere acknowledge it." Voss was quiet for a moment. "She's alive," she said. "We've been following her retirement with some interest for obvious reasons." Another pause. "She tends roses, I'm told." "Yes," Vren said, "she does." "We'll make sure she knows," Voss said, "that she was right officially with documentation, that someone noticed." The channel stayed open in silence for a few more seconds. "3 demands," Vren said finally quietly. "You could have asked for so much more." "We could have," Voss said, "but we didn't build the unbroken horizon to build an empire. We built it so we'd never have to. There's a difference." She paused, and then she added the line, the one that would be carved in stone in the lobby of the Galactic Council's Grand Deliberation Hall before the year was out. "We built this so we would never have to use it. Do not make us reconsider that decision." Vren's channel closed. The recess ended. The delegations returned to relay. The ratification took 31 hours. 17 hours ahead of the deadline. It was not unanimous at first. The Vorthian Concord held out for 6 hours over the specific language of the trade arbitration mechanism, requesting modifications to 2 clauses that were, in Voss's assessment, reasonable to accommodate. She accommodated them. The modified clauses actually strengthened the treaty's enforceability. She noted privately that Oxavar IV had been the one to request them, which told her that he had actually read the document carefully, which told her that he was, beneath the condescension, a serious person. Serious people she could work with. The Keth ratified at hour 19. Drevos transmitted his government's confirmation personally on an official channel with full ceremony. He did not add any personal note. He didn't need to. The fact that he had transmitted it personally and not through an aide was a form of communication that Voss understood. The Dravasi ratified at hour 22. Elder Vren read the ratification statement herself into the record, which was unusual. Typically such statements were read by a secretary, and she read it word by word with the careful diction of someone who wanted it noted, in the permanent record, that she considered every syllable of it binding. By hour 31, all 17 signatures were in. The Unbroken Horizon powered down its secondary weapons array at hour 31 and 4 minutes. Quietly, without announcement, the sensor officers of 16 other vessels noted the change simultaneously, and the communal exhale that moved through the fleet was not a sound exactly, but it registered on atmospheric sensors in several ships as a measurable change in pressure. The installation of the human delegation's new seat at the Council's primary table happened, physically, in the Grand Deliberation Hall 4 days later. A facilities crew removed the small table near the eastern observation port, the one positioned to catch the glare from the dwarf star, and replaced it with a full-size delegation platform, identical in every dimension and specification to the Dravasi and Orin tables. The carpenter who bolted it to the floor was a young Vorthian man on his first posting to the station. He didn't know the history of the table. He had been told only to make the installation level and clean. He made it level. He made it clean. He buffed out a small scratch on the surface that had occurred during transport. It was, in his professional assessment, a good table. In 12 intelligence agencies across the galaxy, archivists quietly retrieved old reports from the low-priority filing systems where they had been buried. The Keth report, Thesvar's 63 pages, was the first to be officially declassified and circulated internally, with a new cover note that read, "This analysis was accurate. It was not acted upon. Analysts are reminded that dismissal of inconvenient conclusions based on prior assumptions is a methodological error." Thesvar herself was by now a mid-level supervisor in a border monitoring division. She received a copy of the newly annotated report in her official correspondence on a Tuesday morning. She read the cover note twice. Then she read her own report, which she hadn't looked at in 20 years, and she sat at her desk for a very long time doing nothing, which her colleagues assumed was processing the content of the document. It was. She was also experiencing the specific strange emotion of being told, 2 decades later, that she had been right, and discovering that vindication when it finally arrived did not feel the way she had always imagined it would. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like grief briefly for the years of small dismissals, and then it felt like something she didn't quite have a word for in her language, a kind of clean, forward-facing resolve. She filed it. She went back to work. A package arrived at the Garden Colony on Dravasi, 3 weeks after the ratification. It was addressed to a retired analyst named Vraxa, and it contained 3 things: a copy of her original 20-year-old report, stamped with a new classification of historically significant and accurate Terran Republic intelligence acknowledgement, a holographic recording of the moment the Unbroken Horizon decloaked, taken from inside the Unbroken Horizon itself, looking outward at the formation of 17 Council vessels, and a personal note on paper, handwritten, signed by Ambassador Sira Voss. The note said, "We know you saw us. Thank you for trying to tell them. SV." Vraxa read the note 3 times in her garden, sitting in a chair she had put there specifically to face the afternoon light. Her roses were in bloom. She was 91 years old and had spent the better part of 20 retirement years tending this garden and thinking, on clear evenings, about a report no one had read. She folded the note carefully and put it in her inner pocket, next to her heart, which was still quite strong for her age. She sat there for a while in the sun. The first full session of the Galactic Council with humanity at the primary table was called to order at 1400 standard hours, 17 days after the ratification. The agenda included the routine business that never stopped being routine: border arbitrations, trade logistics, Infrastructure assessments, the 10,000 small negotiations that kept an interstellar community functional. Sierra Voss walked into the grand deliberation hall and took her seat at the new table. It was, she confirmed, perfectly level. She arranged her notes. She looked at the eastern observation port, where the pale dwarf star's light no longer fell on anyone's eyes, because her table was in the center of the room now, where it should have been all along. Secretary General Vurath called the session to order. He read the agenda. He looked around the primary table with the slightly adjusted manner of a person who has recently recalibrated several assumptions and is navigating the recalibration in public with imperfect grace, which is all any of them could honestly do. "We will begin," he said, "with the Trade Infrastructure Review. I'd like to open with remarks from each primary delegate." He paused, and with a formality that was new but to his credit entirely genuine, he turned first, not to the Dravasi, not to the Keth, not to the Orin as the session's hosting species. He turned first to the human table. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "would you begin?" Sierra Voss looked up from her notes. She looked at the room, all 17 delegations, the ancient walls, the alien air, the stars visible through the observation ports, and one very small, perfectly level table that had once stood in the corner. She folded her hands. "Thank you, Secretary General," she said. And she began. Somewhere in the outer colonies, in a facility that didn't appear on any public star chart, a crew of engineers was beginning phase 1 of a project that had no name yet. The project had been approved quietly, without announcement, because humanity had learned, in the long way, the patient way, the way that takes 90 years and costs more than any ledger can hold, that the most important things are built in silence, and the galaxy notices when you're ready. They got to work. And